The Bob Murphy Show, episode 265.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. This episode, you're going to be hearing a rebroadcast of a conversation I had with Luke Avery. Luke is the host of a Bible YouTube channel, Bible Studies YouTube channel. And last year he had a sort of series that he was redoing this year, and he's calling it Lambda Conversations, Faith in the World. It's the Lambda Weekend Retreat 2023. And I was the initial guest, and he just had a series. It was a lot like a live stream. I think it went for 5 hours on the first day, and then I'm not sure how many days after. It's still ongoing, I believe, as I record this intro. So Luke is very familiar with free market economics, libertarian political philosophy, and he's, of course, a Christian, Bible-believing Christian. And so we just talked about the intersection or non-intersection, in some instances, of those different perspectives, and just, how does that stuff interact? If you're a Christian, can you be a libertarian? What's the relationship to Austrian economics? That sort of thing. So probably a lot of you would have heard people talk on these matters before, so it's not brand spanking new. But we did get into things that I don't think I've discussed with other podcast hosts before. So anyway, I would encourage you to listen if you like the topic. Hope you enjoy it.
Hello, everybody, although we have 0 viewers at this point. But very shortly, people will come flooding in. This is the beginning of Lambda Conversations 2023, and I'm extremely excited to have my first guest, Bob Murphy. Bob, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Luke. How are you?
I'm very good. I feel like I've got a big mountain to climb this week. I've never done anything like this before. Also, as a bit of an intro to you, I think I've listened to every single episode of the Contra Krugman podcast. So I don't know how many of your listeners got addicted like I did, but while those were still being released, I was there clicking refresh, waiting for the next episode to come out.
We definitely did have a hardcore group that was very sad when it was retired, but yes.
You ended up running cruises and things, didn't you?
Yeah. I don't remember off the top of my head how many we did, but yes, we had a cruise associated with it, and it was surprisingly awesome. The cruises,
Really?
It sounded like a harebrained scheme, but it was really fun. And it was a good mix of, like, you're on a cruise. Okay, not everything is political, but also it wasn't merely a cruise. Like, we had events that were tied to, Krugman and Austrian economics and so on.
It's funny how Paul Krugman has united a community of people who largely disagree with him. But that's how life goes, isn't it? So people form communities around odd things, and then you end up with just human connections and much friendlier outcomes than just the maybe people would think economics. So it's going to be a dry subject, but you just find lots of warm people behind all the conversations.
Well, yeah, and that's partly why I like the Austrian School of Economics. Is I would go give a talk somewhere, and then people would come up after and say, "Oh, wow, I hated economics in school, but what you just did, that was different." So,
do you want to give a quick explanation of what do you mean by Austrian economics?
Yeah, sure thing. So it's a school of thought. There's a Chicago school, the Keynesian school, Marxist school, and it's named after the founders. Of course, they were from the country of Austria. That's where the name comes from. And it's, I don't know how much detail you want me to get into. So in modern times, they do tend to be very free market, but it's not an ideological. It's not that Austrian economics consists of a bunch of propositions about what the government should or shouldn't be doing. It is, an economic school of thought with its own methodology. But it does tend to be free market in its scope. And I guess to distinguish, so yes, the Austrians typically disagree with Keynesians about the efficacy of government spending programs to revive the economy, things like that. But what makes the Austrian school distinct from other sort of free market friendly approaches, even the Chicago school, if people know about Milton Friedman and things like that, is the Austrians have a theory of the business cycle that says it's due to government intervention in the banking sector, where it floods the market with cheap credit, interest rates get pushed to artificially low levels. That causes the unsustainable boom, which leads to a bust. So what's interesting about that is in the Austrian approach, then, like the Great Depression was caused because the Fed did too much. Whereas even one of Chicago school economists, they think everything was great through the 20s. And then for some reason, the Fed fell asleep at the wheel and didn't pump in enough money. And the Austrians, it's like the other way around. It's like, no, the Fed pumped in too much money in the 20s, and that's what caused these problems. So some of the names are Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Friedrich Hayek.
I remember at one point, years and years ago, I got really into Milton Friedman, and I thought this guy makes a lot of sense. And then when he started giving his explanation of the Great Depression, that the Fed should have acted more, I did a sort of double take. I thought this can't be. This doesn't seem to fit with the rest of his approach to thinking.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, if that is what happened, that is what happened. But it is true that if you're attracted to the Friedmanite philosophy that the government usually screws things up, I had a similar experience as you, but originally I did because I had been taught in whatever it was 7th grade that the reason the Great Depression happened is because in the 1920s there was no business regulation and the unfettered free market capitalism, there was wild speculation and blah blah blah, and that's capitalism for you, which on the face of it doesn't really make much sense, because however much Wall Street was regulated in 1929, it was less regulated in 1919. And so how come the Great Depression didn't happen earlier, right? So that story on its own doesn't really make much sense to blame a lack of regulation for the Depression. But yeah, so when I first read Friedman's diagnosis, and for the listeners that never heard of it, what happened is the money supply collapsed in the early 30s. And so Friedman blamed the Fed, which had been founded in 1913. So the Fed had been up and running for a while at this point, saying that's one of the Fed's primary jobs is to not let, a financial panic drain the system of money. And so that's kind of the problem. That's why prices fell and that led all these problems. And so at the time, I was like, oh, okay, see, so it wasn't laissez-faire capitalism that did it. It was the Fed didn't do its job. But then, later reading Rothbard, he was explaining that it's ironic on the face of it that Friedman is complaining that the Fed didn't engage in enough inflation in the early 30s. And that's why we had, that seems kind of funny for a fan or a champion of the free market. So again, just to make sure the listeners got the argument, the Austrian story is that the boom of the 20s, like why was the stock market bid up so high to then come crashing down in 29? It's because the Fed had an easy money policy, partly to help bail out the Bank of England, which after World War I was trying to go back to its pound gold parity.
Yeah. So the particular topic that I wanted to talk to you about for this hour, I wanted to both explore your thoughts on economics, but also your faith. So maybe we could start there. How did you find Christ?
Okay, sure. So I have told this story elsewhere, but I will give the abbreviated version. And obviously, if you want me to go into more detail, feel free. So I was raised as a Catholic. We went to a Catholic, we call it grammar school, K through 8, whatever term the listeners use for that school. In high school, it's a different one, but they were both Catholic, explicitly Catholic. I went through the Catholic sacraments up through what's called confirmation, but it was not like when I would meet other people and they would like say, do you love the Lord or something? I didn't even know what they meant by that. Okay, I'm just trying to get across like how, even though technically, I would have called myself Christian, like the way American Protestants discuss Jesus and so like that was not in the tradition that I was taught growing up. That, like Jesus is your friend kind of thing. Like that was not part of it really. And so I drifted towards science, and I love science, and I thought I was very logical and rational. So I actually was an atheist by the time I was an undergrad in college. I had just slowly fallen away from things. And in fact, I called myself a devout atheist. I thought that was clever. Right? And I would go right, so, and I actually planned on writing a refutation of Christianity. Like I would go read the Bible in order to get ammo to that. And I would read, stuff from Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, and other, I think George Smith had a book on atheism, stuff like that. So that's where I was. And then in grad school, again, I'll tell the quick version. I was going through a lot. I was very isolated, socially, and it was just in a bad spot. And then I noticed, so one of the things going on is like, I had real bad skin problems, and like the skin on my face was flaking off, and I was seeing dermatologists and nothing was working. And then I just had this epiphany one night and realized a lot of the things I had been worrying about I was wrong. Like I just like saw it and realized, oh, wait a minute. I've been just assuming things are really bad, but I'm missing something big. And I felt this relief just wash through me. And my friend at the time, who was, not religious, said, oh yeah, your demons left you. And I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase that he used. And so when that happened, I just instantly knew that, I don't need to go see the dermatologist and my skin's fine. Like it was just a stress. And that was correct. Like my skin would, repaired very soon. Like I had this immense urge to go chug orange juice and stuff. Like my cravings even were for things I needed, not junk food. It was interesting. So when that happened, then I said, oh, I bet you there really was this guy Jesus walking around healing people because they had leprosy because they thought they had done a sin or their parents had or whatever. And so then once I had firsthand witnessed the power of like your own beliefs and how that could make your skin messed up, I could believe that if you were raised as a devout Jew and then who you thought the Messiah was walking around and healed you, you would believe it and that could actually work. So I still thought, they were all crazy, but it made sense. And to me, that made more sense for the historical record, that there really was this guy. Like it couldn't have just been complete myths or something. Like to me, that seemed possible, like for the effect that it had on the world. So that's where and then just things just kept coming. And again, I won't tell it full, but it was, I got to the point, some things I sort of like set up conditions. Okay, well, if this happens, then I'll know there is a God, and it did happen. And I was like, and I felt guilty because when I was an undergrad, I was like trying to talk my Christian friends out of it. Like I thought I was freeing. I wasn't being a jerk. I thought I was freeing them from their, superstition that their family gave them as a kid. And so I felt awful once I realized, oh, God exists. And I said, I'm sorry. And I heard a voice in my head say, I forgive you. So people can do that what they will. And then so at that point I believed in God, but I still wasn't necessarily a Christian. And I looked around and the other, Hinduism or Buddha, like they just didn't seem right to me. And it kept coming back to Christianity. And so finally I realized that, Jesus was everything. Like he was there the whole time for me. And I came back and accepted him as my savior.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Praise God. Yeah. I wonder if you were a very effective anti-evangelist in your atheist days. Did you ever find out if you...
Oh, so, I mean, the specific people that I have in my life that were my friends, fortunately, no, there was another guy, he was actually my roommate at the time who was a Christian, and he would, I would have them, because my line of attack was to say, if you had been born to Muslim parents, you'd be Muslim right now. The kid I said that to, the guy I said, he actually said, yeah, you're probably right. And then my friend, talked him out of it and said, no, I don't remember his exact words, but so no, as far as I know, I did not make anyone give up their faith. Thank goodness.
Yeah, when I was at uni, I was big into apologetics. I used to do Textotosian things where you'd go and argue all the logical things. I've since come around to the perspective that actually the apologetics was really useful for me. It kind of reinforced my faith, but I don't think it is very effective at persuading other people. It tends to be a heart issue, and that the intellectual perspectives are kind of cover over, the rebellion that's going on.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It is the same with me. The college friend I'm telling you, I mentioned a minute ago, the one that was like fortunately talking our other friends out of like following me down my path. He had given me some C.S. Lewis books, and I remember I think it might have been the one about the Tao or something, but I remember finding it very unpersuasive when I was an atheist reading it. Then once I had my conversion experience, I went back and reread it. I was like, oh wow, he's making a lot of sense here. So it's a similar thing. And so I totally get, like, I think partly why did God let me wallow in that state for so long was so that I would really understand it. So like, I think I'm able to communicate with current atheists, especially if they're coming at it from a, I'm logical and scientific, and I know how science works. That's why I'm not a stupid Christian. I think I can talk to those people and see, you know what I mean? But yeah, I wouldn't be able to logically convert them, just like that would have bounced off me at the time. Like it was things happening. And
it always feels like it's very easy to demolish an intellectual position. It's easy to be destructive in that realm. The thing that really draws people to believe in something is that they want to believe it. I guess it's, on the one hand, either you are drawn to the pleasures and the delights of what's available, or I would argue you see the love of God and you're attracted the other way. But either way, the draw is kind of more visceral feeling of like, okay, I'm going to go and find some reasons to believe that this is true.
So, I mean, I think you are right, but I want to make sure, like, in case any atheists are hearing this conversation, what I'm certainly not saying, I don't think you're saying this either. I'm not saying Christianity is irrational. In other words, the atheists, when they come forward with their objections to God, why would a good God let, people suffer in hell for eternity, or whatever the thing? Why does he let the Holocaust? And I have responses, or this is crazy, this passage in the Bible where, the Israelites are ordered to go slaughter babies. What the heck is it? So I can have responses to those, and I think that my responses are valid. You know what I mean? So it's not that I'm conceding, oh yeah, you guys are right in terms of logic, but you just got to feel, man. That's not what I'm saying. I am just acknowledging, though, that even though I think I do have logically correct, sound refutations of all these, Christopher Hitchens diatribes or whatever, I just know back when I was an atheist, I wouldn't have found that persuasive. Even though now I think, no, what I'm saying is, it's not that I'm saying you just got to have faith and trust me, you would see it if God talked to you. That's not what I'm saying. But you'd like you said, it's like your worldview is just so different that what seems like an airtight, compelling argument to one person seems goofy to somebody else.
Yeah, I totally echo that sentiment. I am also fully persuaded that I have a rock solid intellectual position that I could defend rationally. But it's just at a human level, I've just learned to appreciate that humans are very rarely rational actors.
Well, that's even like I'm not a salesman myself, but I do a lot of consulting for people who like are, and they, that's one of the first they say, like, people, they buy based on emotion, like, or at least that's a school of thought. Maybe others disagree, but it's, in other words, like, you're not, if you go into it trying to show them, oh, here's the product I want you to buy, and look at all these attributes, like, that doesn't work. Like, you got to make them identified. They picture themselves with it, and how do you feel with? So, I mean, you're not going to lie about it, and where the product does matter, but it's like the point being that you don't just logically convince someone of the merits of it through reason.
Great. Okay, now I want to look at the question of how do we see Austrian economics from a Christian perspective? Like, when we look in the Bible, do we see any economic ideas? Can we as Christians take a, do we have any additional, I guess, biblical evidence? So I've got some questions that are hopefully steering us in that direction. Let's start with, do you see the teachings of Jesus, things like love your neighbor as yourself, aligning with the principles of, say, libertarianism? How do those ideas from Jesus reconcile or rub against the economic principles that you expound?
Sure. So just to avoid confusion, so libertarian political philosophy is distinct from Austrian economics, just as a scientific discipline, even though in practice, the people who are one tend to be the other.
Do you want to just be clear then? So what is Austrian economics? What is libertarian philosophy? How much are you in each of those camps?
Okay, sure. So libertarian political philosophy, certainly in the way Murray Rothbard defined it, and a lot of subsequent libertarians, adopted. It's based on what's called a non-aggression principle. Some people abbreviate as the NAP, saying it is immoral to initiate aggression on somebody else. Okay, so it's basically saying you should have respect for property rights, because aggression. You said, what's aggression? It doesn't just mean yelling at somebody. It means violating their property rights is basically what that term is shorthand for. So a particular, so for example, it sort of overlaps with the use of rights language. So to say someone has the right to use heroin, it doesn't mean necessarily it's moral to use heroin. You can say that's immoral, you shouldn't do that. But what it would mean to say they have the right to do it. And then if you're a libertarian, conventionally, you would say, I don't think the government should use force to interfere with that, because the person using heroin is not initiating aggression on anybody else. And so therefore it would be wrong for us to, throw them in a cage or do something else to try to stop it, even though...
Would that be a negative right?
Yeah. So in this tradition, everything is a negative right. It's basically just saying this is what is impermissible to do to people. They have this zone or sphere of autonomy within which they can do what they want. And you can try to convince them otherwise. And certainly you can pass moral judgment on them, but you can't use force. It's the idea. So that's libertarianism. And then Austrian economics, again, it's a description of how the world works. Physics doesn't intersect necessarily with, libertarianism or anything, or conservatism or anything. It's just, no, physics is what it is. This is the rules that we've come up with for how the material objects, go through the world. So likewise with Austrian economics, it's an understanding of how the economy works that, strictly speaking, does not have value judgments in it. So strictly speaking, Austrian economics could say, it doesn't say socialism is bad. It just says, if you socialize the means of production, you're not going to have rational economic calculation. The planners won't know whether they're using resources effectively. But if you don't mind people starving, okay, do what you want. That it's not.
Yeah. So it exists in the realm of is rather than the realm of ought.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas libertarianism begins with the ought of the non-aggression principle.
Right. So it's, again, I see there's a lot of sloppiness involved. A lot of people calling themselves libertarians make the mistake of saying, as long as you're operating within your rights, what you're doing is moral. And that's not what libertarianism says, or at least is conventionally defined. Right. And it just says, no, it does involve morality, but just says it would be immoral to violate someone's rights. But that doesn't mean the opposite of, as long as you're not violating your rights, whatever you're doing is moral. That's not, again, you could, cheating on your spouse, most people don't think you should go to jail for that, but most people would agree that's immoral or sinful, if you want to use that language. But it doesn't necessarily mean you broke the law by doing that, or that, so.
And I suppose a libertarian might also think there could be a situation in which there is two evils, one of which is aggression, and the other evil might be worse. So you might actually violate the non-aggression principle in a lesser of two evils sort of scenario.
So that's an interesting point, and it probably will come back to what your original question to me, so it's worth going down it. Right. So there are, you can come up with crazy, like David Friedman does this a lot. He's the son of Milton Friedman, does this a lot, where he's pushing against the non-aggression principle. You're just wondering, is it right to, as Murray Rothbard, to try almost approach it like it's geometry or something? Oh, we have these axioms and we build on it, or is it, is that too rigid and dogmatic, and you're sort of being robotic? And he comes up with sort of contrived examples, but they make the point that well, suppose aliens showed up tomorrow and said, you need to sacrifice one person or else we kill everyone on Earth. Some people might say, okay, we should do that. Or even less extreme, that there's a comet coming that's going to blow up the Earth. And if the government's levy a $1 tax on every person, we can come up with the money to knock it down. But for whatever reason, the free market can't raise the money. Would it be immoral to the government to tax everybody $1 each to stop the Earth from getting blown up? And so, you can come up with scenarios like that. And there it's in Friedman saying, so like in a situation like that, I'm in the weird position of agreeing, yes, technically we violated people's rights, but I would be rooting for the government to do so, which seems kind of weird, in a situation like so. Anyway, yeah, there's stuff like that. It's tricky though. There's, some of the hardcore people who say, no, for one thing, some people are just saying, no, it's principles are principles. And actually, if you're theistic, you might, let the Earth fall. Who cares? Just doing what's right because we're going to be with God afterward anyway. So who cares? There's that element. But even, on a secular term, some people are concerned if you go down that route, well, then you can kind of do anything. Well, I don't want people starving. So that's why the government can tax everybody and have food stamps. So, you know what I mean? You can justify anything once you say, well, there's these other bad things we don't like either. It's kind of like, the whole point of the non-aggression principle was to give us a bearing and to say, no, the ends don't justify the means. So when you say that, it sounds great. But then, you come up with particular examples where there are really bad things that might happen. And so the ends do seem pretty good. And so, there's.
Well, okay, let's start with this then.
Okay.
Do you think the non-aggression principle can be derived from anything that's in the Bible?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of Jesus' teachings, golden rule, most people would not want somebody to initiate aggression against them. So, okay, if you don't want that, then don't initiate against somebody else. Loving your enemy, turning the other cheek. I think a lot of that stuff, do not meet evil with evil. The vengeance is the Lord's. Things like that. I think all certainly are consistent with and underscore that. Also, I think you could derive a baseline respect for property rights too, even just like from the 10 Commandments. Like you're not supposed to steal. So to me, that shows property. It's not that God is against property rights.
I feel that we have to address what has been a big big.
Well, can I ask? Stop you for one? Let me, because I actually didn't answer. So,
oh yeah, please go.
A certain, could you have said, like, is there a tension, for modern day Austrian economists or people who believe in Austrian economics and or libertarianism and Christian? So, I actually have stopped volunteering that I am a libertarian, and the reason is it's not because all of a sudden I've seen the merits of aggression. It's because it's
like Google removing "do not be evil" from there.
Yeah, right. It's because just so many people, both on the right and the left, who call themselves libertarians, just in the last few years, have been annoying me, and I don't want to be associated with that. But also more relevant to this conversation, perhaps, is because also like. For a while, I would call myself an anarchist theorist because I was an extreme libertarian that thought, no, let the market do everything. I don't volunteer that because there's a sense in which I'm a monarchist, right? I have a king, Jesus. And so, it's now people who are Christian or who just say, just a matter of logic, Christianity is compatible with those viewpoints correctly understood. I don't disagree. Like that's fine. I'm sure this is what you want to get into too, as well, that it's to say you shouldn't initiate aggression in order to fund food stamps is consistent with you have a duty to help the poor, to feed the poor.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right. So that there's that. I want to make sure, I'm sure we're going to get into that stuff, but I just want to make sure I'm not misleading anybody up front. But I also am saying, even though I think they're compatible and you could derive a lot of justification for those perspectives in the Bible, even so, there is, like, modern libertarianism does tend to have a very self-centered perspective that is, at least there's a tension with Christianity.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. I guess myself, I would once have also described myself as a libertarian and verging on anarchist, where I thought really all the evils of the universe could be fixed if only people could understand the power of the free market. That's basically where I had got to, and I wouldn't call myself a libertarian anymore. And it's interesting you use the word monarchist, because I tend now to feel that, well, actually, let's go on a slight tangent that I wasn't planning on, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on. So, something that I've wondered about is whether the libertarian view on the world is both an understanding of Austrian economics, which I think is correct, and maybe derives from the realization that value is subjective. Like you realize that, okay, the cost of anything just comes down to human decisions and needs and the interactions of people. And you learn lots of interesting things if you explore that question. But also, there seems to be this underlying belief in libertarianism that when paired with democracy, sufficient conversation and understanding will eventually persuade everybody towards limiting government, and I think I've just lost a lot of my belief that the democratic system is what it appears, or is what it claims to be. So, although we all go through the process of voting and listening to all the political candidates and so on, in fact, the real way that the world works and the way that power works remains a small group of people, powerful decision makers who are self-interested, and they don't want to give up their power. So that it is sort of it was almost utopian to believe that you could move towards a smaller state through democracy, in a similar way to which you could argue that it's naive and utopian for the socialists to believe that in a situation with zero incentives, people would continue to work hard. I almost feel like I had two moments of my eyes being opened. One of which was becoming aware of Austrian economics and therefore moving towards libertarianism. But then more recently, sort of maybe re-embracing the idea that a good government can exercise its power well, and that some government is always inevitable, and then maybe we can end up discussing the application and over application of like Romans 13, But yeah, so that was a bit of a spiel from me. What do you think of that broad powers of thought?
Sure. Yeah. So you raised a lot of good points there. So one thing is you made the sort of offhand remark about value being subjective. So again, for the listeners, in Austrian economics, that was partly the foundation of the school. So it was in 1871. Karl Menger is the father of Austrian economics, and he came up with a new way to explain economic value, basing it, on the subjective preferences of the individual, as opposed to the classical economists, people like Adam Smith, who had what we would call a cost objective theory of value, saying like, oh, when you're trying to understand, like, how come the stagecoach trades in the market for this many bushels of wheat? Well, look at how much labor power goes into both of them. And that kind of makes, so they're looking at it as if stuff's flowing into the goods, and that's how you figure out what they trade for against each other. And Menger flipped it. He said, no, it's ultimately subjectively, if you put a lot of labor power into something that was tasted terrible, no one's going to buy it. Whereas you're just walking in the woods and you found some brand new thing that was amazing, and you didn't know how many hours went into making it, it wouldn't matter. You could still go sell it for a lot, right? So, and so that was called the subjective revolution, or it's called the marginal revolution, but it has to do with subjective value theory, which is the modern theory of all standard economics, not just of the Austrians. But you're right. This does bleed into what we've been talking about, that there are some who say, oh, there's no such thing as objective morality because Austrian economics teaches value is subjective. And that's actually a mistake. It's just the same word, but it's being used inappropriately, right? So you could be an economist who believes in subjective value. They say, oh, the reason cigarettes have a price in the market is because people like smoking. That doesn't mean smoking is okay or is moral or is good for you. So anyway, so that's one thing. As far as democracy, I agree with you wholly. It's funny because even the American founding fathers and stuff, like they didn't like democracy either. Like America was supposed to be a republic. Mm-hmm. And the cliche about democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner, that kind of thing. So, everyone knows that just because the majority votes on something doesn't mean anything. And then even it's, to call something a popularity contest usually means it's not based on merit. Like that's almost like a slur against something. Oh, this is just a popularity contest.
Right.
Usually means this is stupid or, this is not good. The winner of the popularity contest is probably not the thing that was the best in whatever the category is. So, so there's that element. And yes, in terms of me, just practically speaking, I long since stopped believing, I live in the United States, of course, that what we need to do is convince enough people to send the right people to Washington, D.C. I've given up on that. Now, I in terms of just practical things, what would happen? I wrote a pamphlet saying that the state of Texas should break away and be its own country. To me, for me to see significant gains in human liberty in my lifetime, I think it would be through that sort of process, as opposed to just educating the public and then the existing institutions get reformed because they put a new personnel.
Great. Okay, good. I'm glad we went down that track. I didn't have it in my notes, but that I'm really interested to get your perspective on that. So let's do Romans 13, because I think it's an important passage that has a genuine right. I think it gives pause for thought, rightly, to the significant number of Christians who pull in a free market direction. But I also think that it has been pushed way too far by some people to the point which it then would come into conflict with other bits of the Bible, other bits of the New Testament. So I guess you're familiar with the passage.
I pulled it up just to refresh my memory, but yes.
Okay, great. So do you want to comment on what are your thoughts of this chapter? What is it saying, and what is it not saying?
Okay, sure. So one thing I would say with all this stuff is I am concerned sometimes that at least American Christians who are libertarian or free market oriented, sometimes when I hear them comment on certain of these passages, I think they're too quick to just well, I couldn't mean that, and their argument is almost, well, because from my other studies I believe in such and such. There's no way that Jesus would be so dumb as to not understand how cool libertarianism is, so this can't be right. You know what I'm saying? They don't say it explicitly like that, but it's almost, well, no, it can't mean that because that would be very inconvenient for my life if it did mean that, that sort of thing. And so I would just caution and say, no, that's not a good argument. We can't just go into assuming that the answer must be such and such. Having said all that with Romans 13, and so prima facie, yes, I do understand why people who, whether it comes from both right and left. I have seen religious conservatives criticize libertarian types by saying, well, how can you call yourself a Christian and be libertarian? Look at Romans 13. And I've seen it from sort of very interventionist progressive leftists, similar thing. They're doing it a lot of times more as just like a gotcha, but still. So yeah, prima facie, that is hard to reconcile especially if you're an anarchistic Rothbardian type. How you call yourself a Christian? How can that be? on the other hand, though, and I would just say, like, if you just read this at face value, even though it sounds like Paul is saying that whoever the ruler is, God put him there and quit your belly aching, it can't mean fully that, because there's plenty of examples where the ruler is, ordering people to do things that are against the wishes of God, and God's people rightly defy the ruler, and they're punished accordingly, right? So it can't. Paul can't mean any political official who ever gives an order that is coming from God's lips, and you should go ahead and do it, or else you're violating what God wanted. They can't mean that. Also, just in practice, like I said, because I encountered this when I was a professor at Hillsdale College, which is a very conservative, right-wing type place that had a lot of Christians, but also a lot of free market students that were there. And so when the Christian professors or students there would deploy Romans 13, I would say, well, you supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and wasn't Saddam Hussein put there by God? So who are you to say Saddam's a bad leader for the Iraqis? You're talking about how he used chemical weapons on his own people, but that was clearly, he only did it against people who deserved it, right? That's what Romans 13 says, or at least that's what you're telling me it said. So
if we take your approach, if we take what you're saying seriously about your leaders, we also have to apply it to other people's leaders.
Right. And so I have never seen anyone say, or not anyone. Well, yeah, I have never seen anyone. I'm not saying no one in history has ever said this, but I have never seen someone say the U.S. should not have entered World War II because, according to Romans 13, Hitler and the Japanese emperor and blah, 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 were all there, on God's wishes, and they were doing exactly what God wanted them to do. And so who are we to interfere with God? Like, no one to say. Apparently in Nazi Germany, they did use Romans 13 to bolster the regime. Someone told me that once after hearing me make a remark.
Interesting.
Like that. But so anyway, so that's what I'm saying, that I don't, although I've seen Romans 13 used as a cudgel against libertarians, I have rarely seen those people be consistent and say, and therefore, no matter how horrific the regime, nobody can ever, it's not just that we can't use violence to oppose it, but we can't even criticize it because, if they're going around murdering political opponents, it must be that those people are actually evil and deserve it because, so the long way of me saying, I don't think Romans 13 can literally mean that. Now, I've heard, I like the interpretation of people arguing, Paul means the rightful authorities. Like, so if someone really is a genuine, so he says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, to say, so Hitler actually wasn't an authority. Like, he was illegitimate because he was in such violation of, God's law that the people who lived in Germany at the time should no longer have paid him the respect of the authority figure because he had forfeited that through his actions, right? So that's the tag I've seen. And I've also seen people try to explain, and this sounds plausible, that given the circumstances under which Paul was writing this, he had to be a little bit coy and couldn't, that was, perhaps the way to get the message out, so that it wouldn't be confiscated. Again, I don't know enough about the history to say whether that's plausible, but
I always recoil against those sorts of explanations. I mean, it may be correct. I just, when so frequently there's a passage and somebody can come up with a historical context thing that means, it doesn't mean.
I agree. Yeah, and it's kind of goes back to what I said originally when I first started, is that I don't want to just say, well, he can't mean whatever,
exactly,
because I wouldn't like it, so therefore maybe there was something going on and maybe he meant to write different. No, I get what you're saying, but on this one, it's just weird that Paul himself was in prison so much for preaching the gospel. You know what I mean? Like it does seem weird for him to be just apparently saying in black and white that no, if the ruler's punishing you, it's because you did something wrong and you deserve it.
Yeah,
I mean, anyway.
The general gist of it is, and this I think you can find in other letters he wrote as well. Christians should not be troublesome people without good reason, right? Even though the particular rules and laws that you're being subjected to might be stupid and might not be in your interests, that doesn't mean that you can just be a troublemaker. I think that is a reasonable and actually quite a helpful steer, because I mean, certainly over the last, three odd years, I felt a little bit within my, young masculine spirit, the desire to go and be, be a bit of a rebel, to step out and, protest about things that are going on that I don't like. And I think if you're in a situation like Daniel, being asked to worship some person in the place of God, it's very straightforward. You don't do it. On the other hand, is it permissible to pay a tax to the Roman Empire, who you consider to be wrongfully occupying your country? In the case Jesus was asked this, he said it is permissible. You are allowed to pay the tax. Even if you think it's a wrong thing, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. So I see there being maybe a different perspective of, are you a citizen living under what will always be, to some degree, an oppressive overlord, a sinful leader, wrongfully abusing their position? And we see, like, slaves obey your masters, same kind of idea. Like, as a Christian, you ought to be somebody who is a respectful person to those in authority over you, until breaking point, I guess. But on the other hand, the instructions as a leader, as a master to slaves, is like to be compassionate to them, or to, if you're a king, perhaps in the unlikely event that a Christian did end up being in authority over country, then maybe it then flips over to actually, use your rationality to understand the benefits of free market economics and do what you think is actually loving for your population. It's just for good reason. Not much of the Bible is directed towards those people, because it's unlikely that most of the Christians in history will find themselves in that position.
Yeah, I think I'm largely in agreement with everything you just said. Actually, I watched R.C. Sproul did a whole, I don't know if a series is the right word, on Romans 13. And he said a similar thing that what you just said, that he took it to mean that, obviously I'm just distilling it down to a sentence or two, that, as a Christian, you're supposed to do whatever the government, is legally required by your God, unless it's in direct violation of, some biblical command, in which case, obviously, God trumps it. So, if they tell you to do something that's inconvenient, or you think it's unfair, or, they're not using my tax money for good purposes, he's saying, no, that's not a good reason. But if they're taking your tax money to build, a golden calf or something, then maybe in a situation like that, you would publicly say, I'm not paying this tax, and here's the reasons why. But then you go to jail for it. So, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, you're not doing it on the sly. Like, you sort of, making sure everyone knows exactly why you're not doing it and what the reasoning is, that sort of thing. In general, I think that, these passages and elsewhere, clearly it should be that other people are glad there's Christians around, that they're never a problem, except for the rare instance where, the authorities are ordering something that's directly in violation of, telling you to worship the emperor or something as a God figure. But in general, they're good. They're very useful, and they're unobjectionable, and that they're the salt of the earth, right?
So if you were in the position of being a monarch, if you were in charge of a country, to what degree would you consider that you have a responsibility to put in place laws that restrict people's freedom towards doing good? So this would probably be considered in contravention to the non-aggression principle. You're preventing people from acting freely, but if you if you genuinely calculated that this would be more likely for people to do, godly things, maybe an example would be, a law against pornography, right? So which side of this do you fall on, and can you defend that position? Is it the libertarian perspective that it is on each person's individual moral compass and perhaps their own spiritual development to walk in the way they think is best, or can you be that kind of benevolent, protective leader? Is that actually do you have a moral responsibility to do that as a ruler?
Okay, well, that's a tricky one. So I personally I wouldn't want to be a ruler in that scenario. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's partly I would say, well, I would resign, right?
Yeah.
So I think, so what I would say is so if I were a store owner, I would not carry pornographic materials, right?
Okay.
And so, and I would even be fine with boycott campaigns, in a community, like, especially if it was like a store where, kids could be in and see the stuff, definitely I would, but I would also not favor using the government to shut them down. So they kind of flow, like my interpretation of like the Sermon on the Mount and so on. Like, I think, we're called to, for sure, like, inspect yourself first, make sure you're, remove the beam from your own eye before you pluck the speck out of your neighbor's eye, kind of thing. And then, and especially even when you are going to then try to go tackle injustice that's out there, because to say that, the government should pass a law, where, ultimately what that means is if they don't do what you want, guys with guns show up and take you and put you in a cage ultimately. And so to me, that something has gone wrong if it gets to that point, put it at the very least, I think.
Yeah, so you're drawing a categorical distinction between like a company, you own a corner store, that's your possessions, and you have the right to exercise your control over the things that you own, versus a country or a nation or a state, which is I guess playing by different rules, or is not anybody's possession. Is that fair?
So yeah, I am drawing a fundamental distinction, yes, between those things. And right, that my worldview does come out on, I think everything would be, I want to decentralize political power so that as much as possible, and not just for economic reasons, but like, for moral reasons as well. But for 9 different ways, I think that would be a much better humane society if we were to do that. And so, yes, to answer your question, the way I view it, it's not, oh, well, there's the mayor and gets to set what the policies are in the city, maybe subject to the council or something, and then the stores all got to follow whatever the rule is. Like, that's to me not the way I view it. But also, I'm not merely saying, oh, let every store do what they want and whatever maximizes profit or something. No, a community, like I said, if some store is carrying it, like the people in the community can organize a boycott and say, we're just not going to buy gasoline from that gas station if they keep carrying those magazines in the back. So that's certainly within your, that's within your property rights as a customer to withhold your funds from that gas station too. So it's to say, I don't want the government to violate property rights doesn't mean, so therefore just, let each store decide that it's a more nuanced position. What I'm trying to avoid is what I think is the knee-jerk reaction that, oh, if somebody out there is doing something I don't like, I'm going to go to the government and say, send people with guns to make that person stop. Like that to me should not be a normal reaction. And yet that's the go-to mechanism for a lot of people to change the world.
I suppose there's a perspective historically that what began as individual families, growing in influence and power locally, eventually, conglomerated together, and families, the Habsburg family ended up owning such an amount of land that became a modern day country. But there's no obvious moment at which there has been a transition between what is effectively the same thing as your corner store, where you're employing your family members, growing and you know that at some scale, different rules and principles apply. Whereby at a small scale, if you're the overlord of a corner store, you have the moral right to ban pornography. But when you are the owner of a corner store the size of Britain, suddenly that ceases. Not only, I mean, I guess you would actually argue, if you understand correctly, the corner store owner has the responsibility to ban pornography, versus a leader over a larger, controlling a larger number of people suddenly has the responsibility not to.
Oh yeah. So great question. It's like, so instead of picturing as a little corner store, that, Disney World is a pretty big parcel of land.
Good example,
it's not that even the owners, the shareholders around the Disney's corporate structure would let each individual bodega on the property decide. No, clearly they would just have a blanket ban, because you got families coming there. That's not good for business to have pornography anywhere on the property. And so you're just saying logical extension, especially we were talking about monarchy earlier. Well, back in the day, the monarchs, they were the owners of the land, and they had sharecroppers and barons and whatnot. So I suppose, right, even there, as it got bigger, like for example, just consider a regular house. Even there, if the father and the mother, discuss it, and they say, okay, we don't want, no phones for anyone under 8 years old, and they catch the kid, they're not going to take the kid and put him in a cage for 3 years. You see what I'm saying? Like, so I'm just saying the way that the state in practice enforces laws is so far removed from a family making internal decisions, and there's the subjects of the governing authorities of the heads of the household, that I think the analogy breaks down in such that, yes, if you had a 35-year-old son who's living 2 cities away and is looking at pornography, the father can still say, I think you should stop doing that. But most people would recognize that, well, like, he's an adult now, I can't really force him to stop. I could just keep telling him why I think what he's doing is wrong, and he should listen to me as his father. But so I'm saying, even how there's that give and take, or even a church that, one of the members is, everybody knows, is having an affair with his secretary, and the elders confront the guy and finally kick him out of the church. They don't go and tie him down and whip him until he stops. What they ultimately do is just banish him from their events and say, you're not part of our community. So I'm saying this is not at all an endorsement or, hey, anything goes. I'm just saying that it's more about the means by which we let others know our disapproval of what they're doing. When the government does it, typically in practice, what that means is using the threat of violence against people. And I don't think that's, at the very least, that should be an ultimate last resort.
Yes. Well, yes. I just while you were talking about that, it was sparking a thought. So this is just off the top of my head. But perhaps the direction of the problem is the opposite of what we tend to think, whereby the trope is to say that the government has a monopoly on force, and therefore special rules apply to the government. Actually, as I understand it, historically, there was no equivalent of the police force, and there were violent punishments, but they were done more locally. It was almost like a decentralized justice system. So it might actually end up being, when you discovered somebody had adultery, in your village or in your church, it was the elders and the people in the village who then went and stoned the offender. So the the fact that we have put the responsibility of enacting justice into the hands of so few people, or such a small group, powerful, group in society, has created a lot of the problems. And it's a wild thing to advocate for off the top of my head, but I'm suddenly thinking perhaps a lot of these problems would actually be solved by pushing justice out from being a centralized solution.
So yeah, I think so. I mean, because also, right, in the famous with Jesus saying, "Let him who was without sin cast the first stone." It wasn't the Roman soldiers that were there getting ready to do it, right? It was it was going to be the Jewish people, right? So
yes, yeah,
I think you're right that's traditionally how it would have been meted out. That's sort. But then that story doesn't it confirm my point? Is I don't think as a general rule Jesus. So by the way, just I personally am a pacifist, but I'm not saying that's the obvious conclusion from reading the gospel. Certainly, if somebody breaks into your house and has a gun and the homeowner shoots the person, like I totally get that. And I'm not saying, but that's what I mean, like in terms of a ultimate last resort where other avenues have been exhausted. And yes, I think by decentralizing, having competing, so I don't think the state should have the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. I think that should be decentralized. And because there'd be competition, it would be much more humane. Right now, when the police are brutal with a suspect and kill him in custody, everyone just says, well, we have to, next time someone's breaking your house, what are you going to do? Call the pizza place? Whereas if when someone gets food poisoning in a particular restaurant, people get mad at the restaurant. They don't just say, well, next time you're hungry, what are you going to do? Eat stones? Right. So they know because there's competition. If one agency's doing a bad job, the others. So likewise, I do think by devolving it like that, things would be less violent overall. People would come up with easier because that'd be better for business. Like, hey, we stopped shoplifting. We didn't have to shoot a bunch of the criminals. We just tackled them, and then restrained them. We didn't actually kill them. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've got a guy coming on later in the week to put forward an anti-war position. I'm amenable to that perspective. It'd be interesting to talk about just war theory. I think so. One last, I'll stick to one last question.
Are we able to go over? Because it's an hour. I can stay, but I don't know.
It's an hour, but my next guest hasn't shown up yet.
Oh, well, there you go.
Well, until he appears. Okay. I tell you what, I've got a stream later today about Abraham Kuyper. I don't know if you have any thoughts. Have you looked at all into sphere sovereignty and all of his kind of philosophies? Is that something you have any opinions on?
No, I've not studied enough to say.
Fair enough.
Did you want to talk about Acts? About the socialism?
Yeah, okay. That was one of my other. I mean, I've got so many questions here. I haven't got to. Let's do that. So, so in Acts, it describes how the early disciples shared all of their possessions. Does this mean that all Christians should just become socialists because that's what the earliest and most devout Christians did?
So no, and again here, I would caution. I think a lot of times Christians just immediately jump to, well, no, that can't mean that because of free market, and they tout the benefits of the free market and capitalism, and I think you got to make sure like you have scriptural basis for what you're saying, but and I think for sure, if you thought God wanted you to sell all your possessions, give them to the poor, then you would do it. Like that's open and shut. But the question is that what everyone's being called to do? So for the particular, historical example of the apostles there in Acts, I think that no, in general, I don't think Jesus was expecting everybody for the rest of time who followed him was going to do that. I think the reason they did that immediately was just if you think through the context, there's Pentecost. Peter gives this great sermon, thousands convert over the next couple of weeks. So there's all of a sudden it goes from there being just like a handful of Christians to now there's thousands of them. And a lot of them presumably are widows and orphans and and so it makes sense to me that in that mix, if there were a bunch of wealthy landowners and then, multitudes of people who were destitute, that the solution was, the wealthy people sell your stuff, and we'll deal with this, sort of like a triage in a accident type thing. But I also, just practically speaking, is there's Christian communities around the world. Like, clearly it's not one overarching world socialist. At best it would have to be localized. And so, yeah, I do think that it's, you always have a duty to help the poor and whatever, but the best way to do that is maintaining nominal property rights and, what we would call a free market economy.
Brilliant. So Bishop has joined us. Welcome. And I thought it would be fun to ask a question that is a bit of a crossover between each of my guests that you can both comment on. So,
okay, so we'll do that and then I'll bow out.
If that, yeah, let's see how this goes. If it goes smoothly, I'm going to see if I can keep doing it for the next few days. So, the question is, how do you think that the church can best approach navigating political ideologies and all these kind of debates without getting distracted from its core spiritual mission? Should churches stay out of these contentious debates, or should they get stuck in? Do
you want to go, Bob?
Sure. Yeah. So how about I'll listen to those answer, but then I'll sign off.
Great.
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah.
This is a tricky one, right? Because it's, on the one hand, I have been in churches where the preacher, goes on a certain thing and it's, I roll your eyes and, oh, he's getting political again. And I think, on the other hand, though, politics does touch on some serious, moral questions that certainly the church should have something to say about. And so it's a hard, normally it's kind of like people think, oh yeah, when the preacher's saying something I agree with, then it's great. But if it's, talking about telling the candidate, so probably, I think in general, it shouldn't come down to like favoring one particular candidate over another, like more talking about an issue and, what if anything does the church have to say on this particular topic? I guess that would be more trying to inform people about subtleties and here's what the Bible says on these matters, as opposed to just blanket coming out and saying, now, on election day, make sure you're picking, who we've picked in these races or these candidates here. To me, that seems a bit, too nakedly of just the church picking somebody. But on the other hand, yeah, it's to just say, we're not going to talk about politics. That can't be right either, because in the modern world, the political affects so much. It's so much injustice happens at the hand of, government policies.
Great. Theo, what do you think?
Well, I agree with what Bob said there. And I also think there's a dynamic to which church leaders, I think, would benefit from. It's so easy of the quality of content that we think about in terms of political discourse today. And you obviously have certain outlets like the Daily Wire or even Turning Point with some of their organizations that are trying to be explicitly reaching out to churches as part of their larger mission. I think that the quality of the content that church leaders are trying to get to matters. And I think at that same core is, I think one of the great failings of defenders of capitalism in the modern age have been that they have tended to be very culturally, I'm going to say libertarian rather than explicitly libertine, but very laissez-faire in terms of how you approach other aspects of your life. That their defenses have been, I think, very materialistic in its approach. And I think this has helped kind of fuel this sort of layer of uncertainty and skepticism of economics. And so I think there is an obligation to those that care. And I think people like Bob Murphy are a great example of what we need from public intellectuals of the day that recognize the defense of free markets, particularly from a Misesian perspective, is not simply free stuff or number go up. That we're talking about civilizational issues. We're talking about human cooperation. We're talking about better goodwill amongst all. And we need to have our defenders in the economic public realm be more comfortable speaking in religious terms and to take pride in those that are in their practicing of Christianity. And I think that's one of the things that has helped elevate the Institute. Sometimes it's gotten attacked for this, But I think that the willingness of Mises Institute scholars in particular to engage explicitly with their faith. We have a panel on Gary North at Austrian economics research conference this past weekend. We've had a lot of publicly Catholic scholars. And so I think particularly right now, when we can all sense that there's something wrong with society from an economic level, a spiritual level, a political level, we need to recognize that the secularization of society probably plays a role within that, and be more comfortable speaking to this. I know, again, I'm someone who has gotten more interested, who's rediscovered Christianity in my own right last few years because of this dynamic that we find ourselves in. And so again, I think this is one area where the onus is not simply on church leaders, but on public intellectuals willing to defend capitalism to embrace Christianity as well.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Bob, so much for joining. Real pleasure having you.
Thanks, Luke. Nice seeing you, though.
Goodbye.
Okay. Take care, guys.